Hello everyone, my name is Pixlriffs and welcome back to the Minecraft Survival Guide. I hope you're all having a good day. In today's episode, I am starting to worry that our little smelting corner over here is getting a little too small for our needs, especially since we brought back so much copper and so much iron from the previous episode. Not in there, it's in the ender chest. So much iron from that huge vein in the previous episode. As you can see, I've been smelting down a bunch of that into iron ingots, which we're going to use today in the formation of a new super smelter, which is going to take the place of this little smelting corner for anything we need to smelt in large quantities. And I think we're actually going to build it over here. We're going to remove this little fence here, and we're actually going to tack on a platform to the side of this, which is eventually, when I have a bit of time, because right now I'm kind of rushed for time, got to make a couple of episodes before my PC gets sent off for repairs, and I need to build a platform here that's going to become a house. We're going to have a second house attached to the same walkway, and that's maybe going to go some way to justifying the shape of this staircase. It can almost be like a road leading up to several houses, I guess, in the fullness of time. And we can develop this area into what feels a bit more like a village. But anyway, on to the tutorial aspect of this. The most simple thing to do to start off with is to grab a bunch of stones so that we can make some furnaces, grab a bunch of the wood I've been chopping so we can make some chests, and we're going to start off by making 8 chests. We will need a lot more shortly, but for now we're going to start with 8, and we're going to turn 4 of those into hoppers. We're going to make 2 furnaces to begin with. We'll probably make a few more later on, and we'll probably start our platform out here real quick. And on this platform, we're going to set up a very straightforward automatic smelter, which will do for most small-scale jobs. All you need to do is have 2 hoppers facing outwards into this chest, like so. We're going to put 2 furnaces on top of that. We're going to put 2 hoppers on the top of that, and we're going to put a double chest on top of those. Any hoppers feeding into the top of furnaces will deposit items in this top slot here. Any hoppers feeding into the side of furnaces will deposit fuel in the fuel slot, and any hoppers below a furnace will remove items from the output slot and deposit them in whatever their output is, in this case this double chest. So let's say, for example, I want to smelt a bit more of this raw iron that I've got lying around. Breaking that down into the raw iron items, all we need to do is throw all of those in this top chest, and you'll notice they start getting removed from the chest 2 at a time, because both hoppers are now pulling the items out of this chest and depositing them in the furnace ready to be smelted. Now all I have to do is provide adequate fuel to each of these furnaces, and they'll start smelting stuff, with the resulting output items being automatically put in this chest. But you'll remember that I mentioned that we can also automatically input fuel into these, so making a couple of other hoppers on the back here, we could also add a second double chest on top of those. With each hopper feeding into the back of the furnace here, we can put another double chest on top of that, and any fuel we put in there is going to be split evenly between the furnaces as well. I'm going to gather a little bit more coal from the local area. Coal is one of those things that I keep using up and running out of, although it's worth noting that with all the wood we have, this automatic smelter setup is perfect for creating some charcoal. I'll create another identical automatic furnace here just to give you a quick example of that. We'll grab a bunch of the logs from this chest, which I've been chopping from 2x2 spruce trees. Those logs can go in this top chest here. Those will get put into the furnaces automatically, and all we really need to do is put 1 piece of coal in each of these furnaces. Each piece of coal is going to be enough to turn 8 logs into charcoal. So naturally we can take the charcoal out, we can put that in the fuel chest back here, and once the furnaces burn through the coal, it'll start burning charcoal instead. And this whole system becomes almost self-renewing, with the only thing you need to provide being additional logs. And from that point on, you will have amassed enough charcoal that you'll probably never need to use coal as a fuel source again. You can keep hold of that if you want to. However, coal is actually useful in another way as a fuel source, and that's by making full coal blocks. Each piece of coal can smelt 8 items each, which means 9 coal should be able to smelt 72 items if you use all of it individually. But combine it into a block of coal and it will smelt 80 items in one go, effectively giving you the value of 10 coal instead of 9. Part of the problem with that, if you're putting it in a normal furnace, is that the furnace can only receive and output 64 items before the player needs to interact with it, putting new items in, pulling old items out. But with automatic furnaces like this, the items are automatically put in and pulled out, which makes higher powered fuel sources like this block of coal ideal for use in automatic smelting setups. And in this situation, another fuel source you might want to consider is buckets of lava, which you can obviously find from lava lakes on the overworld in the surface or lower down in caves. You can also find an abundant source of lava in the nether if you are close enough to a lava lake and feel like risking scooping the stuff up. A bucket of lava will cook through 100 items if you use it in the fuel slot of a furnace, and it's not being consumed right now because the furnace is still going through that block of coal that I put in there. But once again, buckets of lava can be used most effectively if you use them in an automatic furnace setup when all of the items are just flowing through and being cooked as they go. Already since I set this thing up, we've smelted over a stack of iron ingots, and there's plenty of charcoal flowing in through our charcoal generator over here as well. But one of the things you might be wondering is, how exactly do we get XP from these furnaces? It's been a useful source of XP here and there. We obviously have farms and villager trading and extra bits and pieces around now that will get us XP, but furnaces are still quite a useful source of that, right? Well, there are a couple of options that we can take here. Once a furnace completely burns down, whether it's run out of stuff to smelt or whether it's run out of fuel, I'm going to remove everything from this furnace just so it doesn't get too messy, and I can break the furnace with a pickaxe. That will actually drop any XP that the furnace has accumulated over that smelting time. So while the items have all been deposited in here, you can't take the XP out of the furnace by clicking on something from the output slot this way, we can still get the XP simply by breaking the furnace. Having done that, we can simply replace them on top of these hoppers, and the auto furnace is ready to go again, provided that you put some fuel in the fuel slot. And yes, as you might expect, it's entirely possible to create automatic furnaces like this using blast furnaces and smokers as well. In fact, that's going to be much more effective at smelting down the ores that we brought home, since we have a bunch of raw iron and raw copper that really need processing. We'll grab some of the charcoal from here, we'll feed it into this blast furnace setup, and now both of these furnaces are going to be processing the iron at twice the speed a furnace would. The thing to bear in mind, of course, is that blast furnaces and smokers are specialized workstations. Blast furnaces will only smelt precious materials. They're only good for processing ores, raw iron, raw gold, raw copper, and they can smelt individual ore blocks if you acquire them with Silk Touch, although that is never the most effective way of getting everything you want out of that block. Fortune is always going to be better at getting the precious resources. With one small exception, and that is nether gold ore. If you're able to Silk Touch nether gold ore, then you get the full block instead of breaking it down into gold nuggets. Now with Fortune, it is possible to get a pretty decent amount of gold nuggets. Let me chuck these out in my inventory so we can Fortune this and see exactly how many we get. We got 2 from that block, so really not that many. From the next block, we ended up getting more than 2. We ended up getting 12. So it is possible to get more than the value of a full gold ingot out of a block of nether gold ore if you use it with Fortune. However, on average, it is better to put these in a furnace and smelt them, because that way you will always get a gold ingot out of them, and on average, that gives you more gold than fortuning blocks of nether gold ore. You can get lucky and get more gold from using Fortune, but it is much more reliable to Silk Touch this and smelt it for a full gold ingot. So with our blast furnaces now finished smelting all of the iron that we have fed into them, and these furnaces still merrily producing charcoal, I want to get into the main task for this episode, setting up a larger scale automatic smelter, which players typically end up calling a super smelter. We're going to take down all of these hoppers and chests and stash them in our inventory for later, because we're going to need a fair amount of those for this project. We've also got plenty of charcoal from smelting that initial batch of logs, so that's going to be our fuel source for the super smelter, at least to begin with. And we're going to be using regular furnaces for this super smelter for the simple reason that they'll be able to process anything we throw in there, from food to ores to stuff that can't be smelted in either a smoker or a blast furnace, like glass. We can obviously specialize later if you want to create an automatic blast furnace or an automatic smoker. All you need to do is substitute the furnaces for the specialized types of furnaces and make sure that you only input stuff that is compatible with those blocks. Food for the smokers and ores for the blast furnace. But in total, we are going to be crafting and using 8 furnaces for this super smelter. It can be expanded later if you want to add more to the setup, but I think 8 is a nice number in Minecraft terms, at least, for the amount of stuff that we want to smelt at a time. A full stack of charcoal split 8 ways between 8 different furnaces will leave 8 items in each of those furnaces, which in turn will be enough to smelt 64 items per furnace. So it seems to make sense, if we're going to be inputting fuel and items in full stacks, having it divide by 8 like that just seems like the logical mathematical thing to do. And that's why I've smelted all of this iron beforehand, because if we're going to have 8 furnaces, then we're going to need to have 3 hoppers per furnace, which means we'll need 24 hoppers. I made a few extra just in case, because it's always a good idea to have hoppers around, but really, the first thing we want to establish is exactly where the output for this furnace is going to be. We'll just need one chest for this, although it's going to be a double chest for the sake of having a decent capacity to it. I think we're going to leave that right here, a couple of blocks away from the end of this platform, although the dimensions of this are probably going to change once I've figured out a house design for it. Into this chest, we can place one hopper, and then we can attach 7 hoppers to the side of that. Each of these is going to be pulling items out of the furnaces. So our 8 furnaces are going to be placed on top of those hoppers, and the hoppers form a chain depositing the items in this chest once they are done smelting. Then connected to the back of each of these furnaces, we're going to place a hopper facing into those so that that can deposit the fuel. And along the top of the furnaces, we're going to have the input hoppers going into the top. Now, the next question is, how are we going to transfer items into these hoppers? Are we going to have a row of double chests along the top of this? Well, no, not exactly, because we want to split our items evenly between all of these furnaces. We're going to use a system of minecarts and rails. Just to keep it simple, we're going to create a couple of chest minecarts for this, one for the fuel input and one for the item input. And we can always come back and adjust this setup in future. We've already got some powered rails and regular rails, but I think we'll probably need to craft some more. So let's make sure we have some sticks. Let's make some powered rails. I think, yeah, 24 or so should be enough. We're going to need some redstone power sources for these as well, so we're going to craft a couple more levers. I think we'll need 3 for this. In order to fill these furnaces, we're going to have a section of powered rail that runs across the top of each of these hoppers. Once we get to the end here, we're going to add one more block to this row of hoppers, place another powered rail on top of that, and that is where our minecart is going to reverse direction. Having this final piece of powered rail on there is actually quite important, since we need the minecart to linger over the top of this hopper for long enough that it will deposit 2 items, and if the minecart simply returns from this point, it might only deposit 1 item in the hopper, and then all of the items will get spread unevenly. We're going to do exactly the same thing with the fuel input line over here, and this is the point where we need to be a bit careful about how we place the rails, because sometimes the rails will decide to connect at a diagonal if we place them like this. The same will go for over here. We still need to crouch to place it on top of a hopper, but yeah, the powered rail is going to connect diagonally, and then when we break them, they're going to end up in the hoppers, and sometimes the hopper is going to try and put them in the furnace, and then your furnaces end up getting clogged because powered rails cannot be smelted into anything. Anyway, the trick to making sure rails don't connect like this is to start the rail 1 block further over so it already has something else that it's connecting to, and that overrides the rail's attempts to connect to each other, allowing them to run parallel to each other at a diagonal without shifting their orientation and connecting diagonally. Next, we need to find ways of powering both sets of rails without powering any of the hoppers, since if a hopper receives any redstone power, it will actually become locked, preventing items from moving in or out. So in order to power both sets of rail, it's pretty simple. We just need to place a solid block here and make it a redstone power source, in this case by powering it with a lever. That will light up both sets of powered rail here, allowing minecarts to run across them. Now we simply need to decide where our minecarts are going to be filled up from. Where is easiest for the player to access them? I think it's going to be easiest to remember if we keep the fuel line basically at the level that it is right now. So all of the rails are just going to run horizontally across there. And then the input line for all of the items we want to smelt is going to come down here, and the minecart's going to sit on a block down there, ready to receive any of the items it's going to deliver to the rest of the furnaces. Much like the minecart collection system in our sugarcane farm, we're going to have those start off on an unpowered section of rail, disconnected from the main section of powered rail here, using a regular rail. That way, we can simply flip a lever on and off whenever we want to send the minecart off, and when it returns to this area here, we can make sure that the lever is off. That lets us fill the minecart with fuel to send it off on its way, distributing items to all of those furnaces. We might be able to do the same thing here with this minecart placed on a diagonal piece of powered rail, but when we power that rail, it's simply going to roll into the block and look kind of glitched out. So we're going to need to give this one a bit of space, which means it's going to have to come down onto a second piece of powered rail down here, and from that we will be able to launch it up this extra piece of rail here and on its way back down. It did just jostle that other minecart up there, but that's not going to be affected by it. It's just a small bit of collision since they are neighboring entities there for a second. Of course, right now, that's led to a pretty awkward entrance to what I'm thinking of as this neighboring house, but that's fine. We're going to set up this whole thing in a slightly different position once I've decided on the house design. For now, though, this should be a perfectly functional smelting setup, and we're going to test it using a little bit more charcoal production. Let's grab a stack of charcoal to put that in the fuel chest. We're going to send that off on its way, and oh, it looks like that lever is now powering both sets of rails. Well, that's incidentally fine. Having sent the minecart off once, it's got 48 charcoal left in there, which means that of the 64 we put in there, 16 has been removed, and as we should now be able to see, if we check inside any of these furnaces, 2 charcoal has been evenly distributed amongst them. Now let's put a stack of logs inside the item cart here, and we'll send both of them off on their way. All of the furnaces will light up in sequence, and all of the items should now be distributed evenly amongst these furnaces. Each of these furnaces will smelt some more charcoal for us, and each of the pieces of charcoal will be delivered to the chest down here. They'll sort of arrive in batches of 8, since the smelting operations will complete in quick succession. And we can turn that lever off to make sure that the minecarts return to their stations once they're done loading everything up, and it looks like everything has now been delivered to the furnaces. Now, since we put in a stack of logs and a stack of fuel, obviously the fuel is going to be smelting fairly efficiently. We're left with 7 charcoal in each of these furnaces and a stack of charcoal in the chest, which we can now return to this fuel minecart, and that can start delivering it to the rest of the furnaces again. If we wanted to make sure that these power sources were separate, all we need to do is remove the lever from that, attach it to a different face of the block. It could even go on the end here, and that wouldn't affect the powered rail. It's just because the lever was providing power to the space above this powered rail, and we can rearrange this setup here if we want to. This is just one of the simpler ways of doing it. But really, that is all we need to know for a very basic, very simple, but very effective automatic smelter setup. We're going to break down all of this raw iron. We should have enough to fill up a bunch of these furnaces, so we're going to put that in the item chest. We're going to set the ball rolling here with the fuel, and we're going to activate the item input, and now all of that iron will be smelted as well. Of course, the blast furnaces would smelt it twice as fast, so if you want to create 8 blast furnaces to get your iron smelted faster, then you can do that. But really, the only thing we're missing out on is time. They both use fuel just as effectively, they both provide the same amount of experience when you gather it, and they'll both give us the same amount of iron output to this chest. Now, at this point, you may be thinking, hey, that's all very well, but do I really have to break all 8 of these furnaces every time I want to collect the experience from them? Because that's quite a lot of experience for smelting that amount of iron. And I have some good news for you. You may remember earlier that I said any redstone power source that's powering an adjacent hopper will lock that hopper, preventing items from being put in or pushed out. Well, that is the case for these furnace hoppers here, which are directing all of the output from the furnaces into this chest. And if you want to, you can attach a lever to the face of the furnace, or if this looks a little bit awkward for you, you can put it maybe on the floor next to the hopper. And if we power this block here, that will power the hopper next door and make sure that no items end up getting taken out of the furnace. And at that point, with whatever mending tool I want to mend in my hand, or maybe just an open hand if I want to get some XP back, I can remove the smelted items from that furnace, and it will still give me all of the XP it had accumulated up until that point. So if you wanted to, you could put levers on the floor here and individually switch off the output hoppers, allowing you to collect the iron as it was being smelted. You'd collect one at a time, you'd still get the rest of it from this chest down here, but you would also collect all of the XP by doing that. And with the amount these are going to be smelting after us digging out those huge iron veins, that is really going to add up. So it'll be worthwhile having some method of extracting the XP from these furnaces, and breaking them, while yes, it will work, does require you to replace them afterwards, and you're waiting for all of the items to go through to this chest. It can be kind of a hassle. If you want the levers to be a little more discreet, you could always put them around the back here, but obviously if you power a lever here, it is still going to power the block above it as well, which means we are locking the fuel input hopper. Not that that's going to be a problem when this minecart isn't running, but just something to bear in mind. So now we've covered all of that, I'm just going to let this thing run for a while. We've got a lot of iron to smelt, a lot of copper to smelt, and all of it is going to be useful to us in the near future. So let me unpack some of this stuff that we got from our huge vein of iron. I might keep a few of the raw blocks of iron and copper around, since they might be kind of fun to build with, and it is possible to farm iron ingots from iron golems and copper ingots from drowned zombies. We'll get onto that in a future episode. Whereas there isn't any way of getting raw copper and blocks of raw copper other than digging it out of the ground. So you might want to consider in the long term keeping more of these around when we switch to more automatic farming methods for the smelted materials. Anyway, in the meantime, it's a little too early for that, and we have so much of this copper that we could be turning into building materials. So I'm going to load up this chest minecart minecart with that, make sure we have enough fuel going into the furnaces, and we're going to let this thing run for a while. Now, with all this automatic smelting happening, I think it's a really good time to talk about fuel and the way we use fuel typically in the game. Now, we've already talked about the most effective fuel source the game has, which is a bucket of lava. Every time you put one of these in a furnace, it can smelt 100 items. Before the fuel depletes, the furnace burns out and we need to add something else. But one of the main disadvantages to using lava, aside from the fact that 100 items can't really be smelted unless you're babysitting a furnace or using an automatic setup, is that lava buckets are not stackable. Items like coal or wood can stack up to 64, whereas lava, you can only have one lava bucket in a slot at a time, meaning that you can feed them in automatically from a hopper, but each hopper is only going to be able to store 5 lava buckets, and then, a chest attached to that hopper could store 27, or a double chest could store 54, but you're going to have to go out and acquire those lava buckets individually, filling up your inventory, maybe even your ender chest with them. So while lava is a pretty effective fuel, it still needs to be gathered manually, there are dangers involved in that, and overall, it seems like a good idea to have other options when it comes to fuel for your furnaces. The next most effective fuel source is one that we've already talked about, the block of coal, able to smelt 80 items. It's a more efficient use of regular coal. Incidentally, you cannot make blocks of charcoal, which is the main thing that distinguishes coal from charcoal. And while coal does require caving to go and acquire out in the overworld, it can also be farmed renewably once you are fighting wither skeletons in nether fortresses. So while we think of coal as a fairly precious resource and people like to try and preserve it or use it effectively, in the later stages of the game, we'll be able to farm enough coal that it won't matter whether we use it to smelt 1 item or 8. You might still prefer to use your coal as efficiently as possible and make sure you're smelting 8 items every time you use a piece of coal, and that's entirely fine. That's a perfectly reasonable way to play the game. But the next most powerful fuel source is one that you might not have expected. In fact, we've overlooked it in the series up until this point. Kelp grows abundantly in ocean biomes. You won't find it in rivers, but anytime you venture out into an ocean biome, you are likely to see a lot of these kelp plants waving at you from the bottom of the ocean, and we're going to gather some of that because our next fuel source is a block of dried kelp. Kelp can be dried out in a smoker because, believe it or not, dried kelp is actually a food. It's not a particularly effective food, it's more of a snack than it is a decent meal. But if I quickly take a little bit of damage to make sure that my hunger depletes fast enough or do a little bit of running around, I can actually eat this piece of kelp, and it will eat faster, I believe, than most other foods do. But as you'll see there, it only restored half a point of hunger, making it a pretty ineffective foodstuff. However, we're here to talk about kelp as fuel. Once we've acquired 9 pieces of dried kelp, we can craft those into a dried kelp block, and when put back in a furnace, a dried kelp block will smelt 20 items, which means that, like charcoal, dried kelp is one of those fuel sources that can actually smelt itself renewably. As long as you have a steady supply of kelp, you will always be earning more fuel than you use. Although you've got to consider that for every dried kelp block, for every item that you can use to smelt 20 things, you need to smelt 9 items in order to get there. So realistically, it's only providing you enough fuel to smelt 11 items because it needs 9 to create it in the first place. Despite this, dried kelp blocks remain a pretty popular fuel source, and honestly, kind of a stylish building block when used in the right context. Not to mention that dried kelp blocks can also be broken back down into dried kelp, so they are fuel for the body as well as fuel for the furnace. The next most effective fuel source is blaze rods. Blaze rods will smelt 12 items each, and once or twice in this series you might have noticed me putting 12 items into a furnace along with a blaze rod. So as fuel sources go, blaze rods are worth your consideration. They are relatively easy to farm, and once you are brewing fire resistance potions, you should have no problem just camping out at a blaze spawner with 24 minutes of fire resistance in your pocket and a lot of blazes spawning around you. With looting 3 on your sword, you can get a whole lot of blaze rods, which means powering a furnace for a good long while. And they're also stackable, unlike lava buckets. The next tier of fuel is coal and charcoal, which we're pretty familiar with at this point. They will smelt 8 items each. They're also usable for a variety of other things. You make torches out of both of them, and both are renewable in the ways that we've already discussed here in this video. Beyond that, a surprising variety of wood and wooden items are usable as furnace fuel. You'll end up with planks, slabs, fences, boats, all of that stuff, even crafting tables, even bookshelves can be used as furnace fuel, although personally in my book, if you do that, you're a bit of a monster. You can also even smelt saplings if you have an abundance of those but a shortage of any other fuel. Now, one other fuel source it is potentially worth considering is bamboo. But it's important to note that you will need 4 bamboo in order to smelt a single item. The reason for this is because bamboo can be crafted into sticks, and 2 sticks will smelt a single item, so it makes sense that 4 bamboo effectively equates to 2 sticks. If we put it in the furnace with this raw copper, you'll notice that the bamboo gets destroyed incredibly fast as that arrow creeps along, and it'll all be gone by the time this copper has been smelted into an ingot. A block of bamboo is made of 9 pieces of bamboo, and yet that will only smelt 1.5 items per block, so that's an even less efficient use of your fuel. In fact, if you break that down into planks, each of these planks will smelt 1.5 items, so you'll end up with twice the efficiency if you create bamboo planks, and those can be crafted back down into 4 sticks, and that will smelt you 2 items, but the 2 bamboo planks will smelt you 3 items, so it's better to use planks in this case. And that ratio carries over to slabs as well. You will need to spend 4 slabs in order to cook as many items as 2 planks. There isn't any kind of loophole you can get more fuel out of smelting slabs. It doesn't work that way. But finally, the other things which might be worth considering using as furnace fuel are renewable items that you get from easy sources like skeleton spawners, for example. I can use each of these bows as furnace fuel, and they will smelt 1 item each. You can even throw your original wooden pickaxe into a furnace if you want to, and that can help you smelt your first iron if you don't find any coal anywhere. And one last source of fuel you may not have considered, but wool and carpet can also be burned as a furnace fuel, although they are fairly inefficient. I think 2 pieces of wool is enough to get you a single item, and carpets break down into a similar ratio. They will do basically like 1/3 of a smelting operation. So while you can get a stack of carpet in here, it's not going to last all that long. In this case, we're going to be sticking to large-scale fuel sources because we are doing large-scale smelting operations, although it looks like this is now getting close to burning down through the last of our copper supplies, and look at the amount of copper we have now smelted down here in our output chest. Along with the iron, it is a princely sum, and I need to start converting this into blocks just so I can store it somewhere. But I think at this point it's safe to say that we have covered all we need to on the subject. I'm going to briefly pay a visit to the Wandering Trader since I can't resist seeing what he has to offer today. He's got some coral blocks, which is something we haven't encountered in the wild as far as I'm aware. There might be a warm ocean somewhere around, but I don't think I've run into a coral reef. And blue ice, likewise, is a pretty rare resource, so we might consider trading some of that. But you know what, for now, I think we're probably going to wrap up this episode of the Minecraft Survival Guide. As I mentioned, I will be planning on building a house around this, at which point we'll probably reposition the super smelter to somewhere a bit more convenient, but hopefully this has given you some ideas for how you can up your smelting game in your own worlds. Thank you so much for watching this episode of the Minecraft Survival Guide. My name has been Pixlriffs. Don't forget to leave a like on this video if you enjoyed it, subscribe if you want to see more, and I'll see you folks soon. Take care, bye for now.